Stop the record.
Okay.
It's fine. Just
Good day, everyone. Thank you all for coming. In today's presentation, I'm hoping to give an answer to my research questions, as well as covering my analytical framework and my empirical analysis. This is the title of my research, Conditional Cash Transfers. I'm doing a case study in Indonesia, which is the program name is Implementation of Program Keluarga Harapan. Just to recall, these are my research questions. The first one is why government of Indonesia has adopted conditional cash transfer. What strategies and tools has the government of Indonesia adopted in this regard and why? And how effective have these approaches been? My analytical framework is divided into theoretical justification and the practical justification. I also talk about the criticism around both theoretical and practical, the problems of CCT worldwide, the drivers of the implementation of CCT Indonesia, the strategy as well as the tools for implementing conditional cash transfer in Indonesia. Now let's move on answering the research question number 1. Why government of Indonesia has adopted conditional cash transfer? Numerous studies have found that CCT implemented in Latin American countries have been successful. Bapenas and Arif et al. Have written about this, and this is become the driver for Indonesia government to copy the program in order to achieve similar outcomes. The second one is learning from the experience of unconditional cash transfers that is less acceptable and more likely to create conflict. This comes from the fact that unconditional cash transfer, which was first introduced in Indonesia in 2005, is less acceptable because people argue that it's just like giving people fish, or in this case money alone, not fishing rod or the ability for people to move permanently out of poverty. And because of its unclear eligibility, it results in conflict, and some people also criticize because of its inaccuracy of targeting, and it was blamed of buying votes because the cash transfer, the direct cash transfer, is paid or distributed closer to general election. The third one is international and national agenda on poverty reduction based on Indonesian midterm development planning. PK is designed to alleviate poverty, which is in line with MDGs that will have finished by the end of 2015, and later the Indonesian government extended this program up to 2018. Now we are moving to this is question number 2. What strategies and tools has the government of Indonesia adopted and why? There are 2 strategies. The first one is partnership, because this program is cross-sectional. The tool for this strategy is management information system, because it relies heavily on the importance of information. And the second strategy is co-production, because the program requires co-responsibilities between service providers and service users to produce the outcomes. The tools for this strategy is cash transfer, or what Beam and Conrad called as grants, was classified by Hood as treasure or Freiberg as transactional regulation. Now let's take a look on my empirical analysis. Based on the evidence I collected from Indonesian legislation, I found that PK is largely designed in more contractualist and paternalistic ways, which are more top-down and coercive. By contractualist here means that the government of Indonesia agreed to provide services both in supply side by providing infrastructure availability of teachers and schools and the quality of service, and in the demand side by giving cash transfer, which is conditional upon certain activities such as schooling attendance and sort of things, while the citizens consented to comply with the obligations. And by paternalistic here means that the government of Indonesia directs the behavior of beneficiaries, monitors and supervises their compliance, so they will meet the program outside, which are in the best interest of themselves. To find out whether this program is based on mutualist justification, because some people might argue that Indonesian as other Asian culture is probably based on collective-based values, but I won't go further on much on that analysis because I think it was beyond of the scope of my study. Now it's from the targeting one. This program employs two types of targeting: geographic targeting. In its initial stage, there were 7 provinces that was chosen, and the district and sub-district that were chosen is because of their poverty rates, malnutrition rates, schooling participation that is low, and the availability of health and education infrastructure. And the second one is proxy means testing. This is different from income mean testing because it is difficult, if not impossible, to do income mean testing in Indonesia because some income are unobservable. So using proxy mean testing here related with indicators such as demographic characteristics, physical condition of houses and sort of things. Aside from the targeting types, here the conditionalities act as a screening device and or rationing device. So it is an additional targeting mechanism to only target a particular household that have either pregnant or lactating women or children in schooling age. So as you can see, pregnant or lactating women, they have to complete antenatal care visit, or if you have children between 0 to 6 years, you have to ensure that your children complete childhood immunization and enroll in primary school, or they have to attend school equal to minimum 85%. Just take a brief on the benefits for the beneficiaries of PK. This is the minimum amount if you have one child, and the maximum amount covers lactating or pregnant women, and if you have one child in primary school or one child in junior high school. Now we're moving to the flowchart of PK partnership. As you can see that in the left hand of your side, the Ministry of Social Affairs, which is the funding department, formed the special unit agency that responsible for implementing this program. And in the middle, it is the controlling team and provincial government and district governments. They are responsible for coordinating this program, and post office, which is responsible for distributing the money to the recipients. Actually, I modify a little bit on this chart. I add some more, like beneficiaries, because I think beneficiaries is important because they also co-produce the outcome, and sub-district office, health units and schools because they provide the services to the beneficiaries. Using MIS as government tools. As previously mentioned, MIS plays an important role in PK, and using these tools, operators is the key actors because they are responsible for maintaining the system. I found that problem related to this tool is about low capacity of central UPPKH because they are responsible for managing the system, and some of them are not good at information and technology, and due to geographical constraint like electricity and internet connection, some areas are not connected well to MIS. And from co-production strategy using cash transfer as government tools, I found that facilitators are weak at mixing the tangible and intangible resources, so sometimes it leads to tension between policy goals and service users. But it is interesting to note that some service users, in this case facilitators, they modify policy as a response to pressures. For example, facilitator asks the beneficiaries to spend money on consumption related to program objectives, such as books and school uniforms, although it doesn't explicitly include in conditionality. And some households respond in a positive direction with the conditionality because they are afraid of not getting the money or being excluded from the program. But some spend the money for other purposes, such as repairing the houses, buying livestock, or giving money for their husband expenses and running small business. So this is kind of like a discretion in street level frontline services. And there are many things I found interesting that I would like to add more on my research analysis. And finally, we go into research question number 3. Have these approaches been effective? Overall, based on several studies, I found that these approaches have been effective. Like from Bappenas data, I found that from baseline and after the intervention has taken place, there is an increasing trend of household income, increasing schooling attendance, and regular health visit and other related indicators. However, I also found that it has no significant effect on intra-household gender relation, and it has no altered the division of labor within household. Some weaknesses are also found, like, for example, administrative costs. Unlike unconditional cash transfer, that its administrative cost is lower. This program, because it requires social workers, in this case operators and facilitators, so the administrative costs are higher relative to other social protection programs, and higher opportunity costs, especially for those who live in eastern part of Indonesia. And problems related with MIS results in inefficiency, lack of skills, infrastructure, distortion of behavior change due to the fungibility of money. That's all. That brings the end to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and feel free to ask questions.
Thanks, Jonas. If you'd like to take a seat, I'm sure there'll be questions and comments. And do you want to start, or are you going to wait and respond to some of the others? Any comments or questions?
If some of the things you identify, like the poor electricity and internet in rural areas, regional areas, if those things, I suppose, correlate with poorer areas in general, and that's where you assume that the government is trying to target, are those problems like small implementation issues, or are they sort of very serious problems that could potentially render a lot of this program ineffective If you can't connect to the internet and you have that multi-layered approach where you're relying on districts and sub-districts and post offices, do you see that as a concern?
Yeah, it's a serious effect, mostly in the initial stage of the program, because in the first stage, the national statistic boards have surveyed the targeting household, but because of this raw data has to be verified and validating by the facilitators, but because of the problem of this kind of problems, they use they're not using the validating data. They're already verified the data, but because of the system won't work, so they use manual data, and some beneficiary actually they don't know if the system don't work. So actually whether they meet the conditionalities or not is not a big problem, because the system don't work, but at the time because they don't know, so the facilitator just keep going, and later on they improve the system. But if the beneficiaries know, they can just forget about complying the conditionalities, because if we are not complying, it doesn't matter because the system won't work. But later on, the facilitators and operators in the district level, they improve the system and it works until now, up to now. But yeah, as you are right that it probably in eastern part of Indonesia, because of sometimes electricity just turn on every 18 hours and the connection won't appropriately work well, so I don't know how they cope with the problem, but yeah, they can improve as the program goes on.
Other comments, questions? Cool. No? I've got one just generally in terms of your framework. You talk about the cash transfers, and we addressed this last time, and then you look at co-production and partnership, that you also bring in the hood material on tools. When you write the analytical framework, you're doing the literature review embedded in that framework. You'll need to work out a way of highlighting the centrality of the cash transfers, and then recognizing that from an implementation perspective, they require strategies of co-production and partnering, as well as the use of particular tools, including information and inducements of one kind or another. So I think there'll be a little more work that perhaps needs to be done in terms of just the way the analytical framework is structured. And then secondly, and that's not a criticism, that's just a general comment on, because it's looking to be in pretty good shape in terms of the content of it. It might be just a question of threading it together more effectively and tying it to the fact that your title is implementation of, so it needs to have that implementation focus. The second is when you came to your empirical, you talked about the partnering arrangement, or one or the other, but you then quickly get into transfers and other things that got into the tools. Are you actually going to distinguish in the empirical clearly between the partnering arrangements and the co-production? And if you're not, then one suggestion analytically is just collapse them, because they are able to be dealt with analytically through the same sorts of lens, as it were. Because what Alfred says about co-production is not that dissimilar to what Guest and others are talking about when they're talking about partnering, collaboration, coordination, cooperation. And one way of saving you, A, the necessity to look at the two of them when you apply it to your data, and B, reduce the possibility of repetition, is to simply yourself collapse them as approaches in the analytical framework. It's only a suggestion, but I think that's an easy way out.
I take your point, but because I think
I mean, I have read what this was based on,
Yeah.
but I must admit that, and it read very well, and it may be a translation from more detailed writing to PowerPoint presentation, but I agree with you about how there seems to be a lack of connection between the co-production, which is important in the implementation type things, and then linking that up to your empirical, the punchline question, which is how effective.
Yeah.
And so you talked about tools, but you didn't talk about whether you had that incredibly complicated, diagram about all the relationships that needed to make these work. So you need to, in a sense, talk about, if you want to talk about co-production in the analytical framework, you have to then talk about co-production in terms of answering that final third question. And you could go down the route you were suggesting. I would, co-production is actually more than partnerships, because and I think it's important in this context, includes service users.
Yes.
Which all those things normally don't. They're just between institutions and actors. But the service users are neglected and forgotten. And in social policy area, that is actually quite significant. When you can't achieve your goals unless they do certain things, and conditional cash transfers is a sort of a very good example to look at that, given that that's sort of what you're trying to, the whole point of the tool is to change the behaviour. So I think that's something that we'll need to keep in mind and keep track of as the writing develops, to make sure that whole is, or that link is made.
I think you put it more clearly than I did. I agree that, in a sense, I see the extreme form of co-production and the very real partnership, almost in the old legal sense of a partnership, is what I now call a conflation arrangement. They're fused, so that you really have a sharing of power, a sharing of information, and all those things. But the way Janis put it is quite right. If you're going to keep them separate, they're stages of conflation. The partnering is the loose, the co-production brings in the user, and all you've got to do then is tie it back, A, to the cash transfers, B, to the implementation framework, because that's in your title, and C, as Anne, you put it very neatly, when you come to the empirical, make sure that the mirror, the fact that you actually, having mentioned it in the framework, it's got a structure, guide and inform the empirical. And I think if you do that, that'll work.
And in a sense, you've got the hint there, where you were talking about facilitators actually going beyond their brief in an attempt to achieve change. And then you've got another, but that sort of doesn't, and that's something that can be discussed in those co-production terms. But also you talk about how it's, variable results in terms of people, some people complying, successful in some ways, and that's essentially what success is, compliance in this program. But other people are less, the compliance is less, is not as strong. And so I think you can then bring back co-production in there in terms of the types of incentives, and because co-production is of course all about different sorts of incentives too. That's an important part of co-production. It's not just principal agent type threat coercion type sanctions and stuff. So that's another way of bringing the theoretical parameters that you've outlined into the empirical.
And therefore you have the chance of putting, again, not only your own, as we keep saying, Alice and I in class, your own stamp on the analytical, because it's more than just a literature review. You're actually bringing it together and saying there are these cash transfer arguments, and you've got the three key ones there. You've tied it to the fact that its implementation is crucial and problematic, and you've got stages of patterns of interaction, as it were.
Yeah.
But you could then put your stamp on the empirical, because you'll be reaching conclusions about the conditions for compliance and the obstacles of a technological as well as a humankind. And of course, I'm assuming, not knowing the detail of the, you've given us a lot of detail, it's highly dependent on a lot of goodwill, isn't it? It's people being honest, people being prepared not to turn a blind eye, but to realise that within a broad framework of conditions, you can have a bit of slippage and still meet your program goals.
And that again